She lit the lamp, then locked the truth away. A Miss Marple mystery. The bus from Shrewsbury deposited Miss Marple at the Witchford Holt stop at 2:20, which was 12 minutes late and smelled strongly of someone's wet dog. She thanked the driver, who did not appear to want thanks, and stepped down onto the lane. Her niece Celia had promised to meet her. Celia was not there. Miss Marple was not perturbed by this. She set her bag down beside the post-box and looked about, as she always did when arriving somewhere new. Not at the village green or the church tower, or the things one was supposed to look at, but at the edges. The lanes going off, the shapes of gardens, what people had done with their hedges. That was when she noticed the cottage. It sat at the far end of a track, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, white-walled and set apart from the rest of Witchford Holt, in a way that suggested either privacy or ostracism. She had found over the years that these amounted to much the same thing. What struck her was not the cottage itself, but its position. The land around it was flat and Shropshire inland, all sheep pasture and field boundary. The nearest body of water, a cattle trough she could just make out glinting in the October light. It had at its highest window a small iron bracket, the kind one might use to hang a lamp. She was still looking at it when Celia's bicycle rattled round the corner. "Aunt Jane, I'm so sorry. The curate's taken the car again. He claims there's a dying parishioner in Ludlow, but I rather think it's a cricket match. Are you very cold? Let me take your bag." Celia Hargreaves was 31, incapable in the way of people who've had to be, and perpetually slightly out of breath. Miss Marple kissed her cheek and allowed the bag to be taken. "That cottage at the end of the track," Miss Marple said. "Whose is it?" Celia glanced toward it. "Oh, that was Dorothea Fenn's. She died last week, actually. Rather awful. They think she fell down her stairs." They think. Well, they ruled it an accident. The inquest was Tuesday. Celia was already wheeling the bicycle, moving them gently toward the village. She was 74, and the stairs are very steep. Inspector Ferris said there was nothing suspicious. "Were the lamps lit?" Celia stopped. "What?" "Someone in the village told me about the cottage," Miss Marple said, which was not precisely true. And mentioned that the woman who lived there kept lamps burning in the upstairs window. An old tradition of her husband's, apparently. I wondered whether they were burning when she was found. Celia was quiet for a moment, frowning slightly. "Actually, no. They said the lamps were out. That was one of the things people mentioned, that it was unlike her. She kept them going every night for years." She paused. "How strange that you'd know to ask that." Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking back at the cottage. The village of Witchford Holt had two public houses, one having been a public house since the 16th century, and the other having been a Wesleyan chapel until 1961, and still not entirely forgiven for the transition. It had a chemist's called Tolman and Sons, of which had been Tolman and Sons since before any living Tolman had been born, and a church, St. Edmund's, to which Celia's husband Robert ministered with what Celia called boundless patience, and what Miss Marple, on the evidence of his sermons, would have called something more like optimism. The village also had, Miss Marple gathered over supper, strong opinions about Dorothea Fenn. She was private, Celia said. This was clearly code for something else. "Not unfriendly," Robert offered. He was the sort of thin, earnest man who always tried to find the charitable reading. She came to church. She contributed to the flower rota. She just didn't volunteer much. The oil merchant delivered to her every month, Celia said. 3 gallons, regular as anything. And he mentioned it at the pub afterward. Said she'd taken delivery the Thursday before she died. Miss Marple looked up from her soup. 3 gallons. That's a great deal of oil, Robert agreed, for one woman in a cottage. And the cans when they were found? Robert set his spoon down carefully. How did you know they were found? I mean, yes, the police looked, obviously, but how did you know what state they were in? I didn't, Miss Marple said. Were they? Full. Celia and Robert looked at each other briefly. All of them. Inspector Ferris said it showed she probably hadn't been lighting the lamps recently, that she might have stopped the habit and just not cancelled the delivery. Miss Marple considered this. How very tidy, she said, and asked for more bread.
When I arrived at Witchford Holt, the village seemed perfectly at peace, but we learn that peace is often just a blanket thrown over untidy secrets. I noticed a solitary cottage at the edge of the village. It belonged to Dorothea Fenn. For 40 years since her husband passed, she kept a lamp burning in her upper window. The lamp in her room had been filled but not lit. Someone went to great lengths to make her death look natural. It reminded me of a dear friend who kept a candle in her window, not out of grief, but as a secret communication. The village sleeps, believing it was a tragic fall. But tomorrow I must look closer at those.
She had known a woman in St. Mary Mead, Constance Fellows, whose husband had gone away in 1934, and whom everyone assumed dead by 1936. Constance had kept a candle in her front windows every night for 11 years. Sentiment, people said. Devotion, the kind of quiet grief that expresses itself in small, repeated acts. It wasn't that. Miss Marple had worked it out eventually, by thinking about who could see the candle from the lane, and who might be watching for it. The candle was a signal, not to the husband. He was indeed dead, she'd always suspected that. But to a man in Northampton who came through the village occasionally on business, and who, it transpired, was fencing the contents of Constance's cellar on her behalf. The light in the window wasn't grief, it was communication. She lay in Celia's spare room and thought about this for rather a long time, and the autumn dark outside was very complete. No street lamps on this side of the village, and she could see, if she angled herself just so toward the window, the outline of the distant cottage against the slightly lighter sky. 3 gallons of oil, delivered Thursday, cans found full. A woman dead at the foot of steep stairs, lamps extinguished, on a night when she had every reason to light them. Someone had put those lamps out before Dorothea Fenn fell. And then someone had refilled the cans quite carefully, to make it appear she'd simply stopped. Which told you 2 things about that person. They were methodical, and they had been inside the cottage that night with enough time afterward to put everything right. Miss Marple turned this over. The cottage's lamp bracket was still visible from the lane. She'd checked, on the way back from supper, without appearing to check. Anyone who'd watched those windows regularly would know, on any given night, whether the lamp was burning. Anyone who needed the lamp to be burning, or to stop burning. She closed her eyes. Outside, something, an owl probably, though it sounded less certain than owls usually did, called once and fell silent. I am rather tired of keeping them, Dorothea Fenn might have said if anyone had asked. But no one had. She saw him the first morning. Miss Marple had a habit, in unfamiliar places, of being awake before the house. She dressed quietly, found the kitchen, made tea badly, using someone else's kettle, and took herself outside by 7:30. The air was the particular cold of late October in Shropshire, not bitter yet, but committed to the idea of winter. The hedgerows had gone rust and umber, and a colour she'd never found a good name for. Halfway between copper and defeat. She walked the lane that ran past the church, and curved, eventually, down toward the track that led to Dorothea Fenn's cottage. She did not intend to reach the cottage. She wanted to see the lane itself, how it lay, what it offered in the way of sightlines. Gerald Pitt came round the corner at 20 to 8. He was 67, perhaps, or the kind of 67 that has been carefully maintained. Good coat, good shoes, the sort of man who had decided some time ago what he looked like and had kept to it. He walked at a pace that wasn't quite a stroll. Deliberate. He carried nothing. He did not see Miss Marple, partly because she was at the field gate, and partly because he was not looking in her direction. He was looking at the cottage. He stopped at a particular point in the lane, just where the hedge had a gap. The kind that happens when one section grows faster than the rest and leaves a window through to the field beyond. He stood there. 30 seconds, perhaps 40. Not resting. His breathing was easy. He hadn't been walking fast enough to need a rest. He simply stood and looked at the upstairs window of the cottage, which was dark and had been dark for a week and would be dark from now on. Then he walked on. Miss Marple waited until he'd rounded the far bend. Then she stood at the same point in the lane, at the gap in the same hedge, and looked at the same window. She could see it clearly, both the bracket and the window. If there had been a lamp burning, she'd have seen it from here without question, even in daylight, and she went back to make more tea. "Gerald Pitt," said Celia at breakfast in the tone of someone reading from a character reference. "Very well regarded. Retired solicitor. He was with a firm in Shrewsbury for 30 years, Pitt and Carrow. He's on the parish council. He organised the restoration of the Lich Gate last spring." She topped up the teapot. "He and Dorothea knew each other, I think. They'd both been in the village a long time." "Did he call on her?" "Aye, probably. Most people did, occasionally." Celia sat down. "Why?" "He walks past her cottage every morning." "Well, it's a pleasant lane." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is." She ate her toast. Robert came through in his cassock looking for his car keys, found the car was gone, remembered he'd lent it to his curate, and went back upstairs. A cat arrived on the windowsill and was ignored by everyone, including itself. "Celia," Miss Marple said, "who found her?" "The oil merchant, as it happens. He came Friday morning to check the delivery. The door was on the latch." Celia wrapped both hands around her mug. "He said the house was cold. The fire hadn't been lit, and neither had the lamps, which he said was very odd. He found her at the bottom of the stairs." "Was anything disturbed?" "The police said no, but then the police weren't looking very hard." Celia hesitated. "I don't mean that harshly. Inspector Ferris is thorough. It's just that a 74-year-old woman at the bottom of steep stairs, in the dark, it reads as accident. It's meant to read as accident." Miss Marple looked at her niece with some approval. Celia had always been the sharper of her sister's children, though she'd never seemed to know it. "The lamps," Miss Marple said. "Dorothea had been lighting them every night for how long? 40 years, supposedly, since her husband died. And the village knew this. Of course, everyone knew. It was one of those things about her, the way everyone has things." Celia paused, like how Mrs. Hodge always sings in the post office, or how the parrot's dog sits in the road on Tuesdays for no reason. Dorothea's lamps. Something you'd notice the absence of. "I suppose, yes." Celia was quiet for a moment. "Do you think it wasn't an accident?" Miss Marple folded her napkin precisely, corner to corner.
In unfamiliar places, I have always had the habit of waking before the rest of the house. They say a morning walk is purely for one's health. When a man of 67 stops to stare at an empty window for 40 seconds without moving a muscle, he isn't admiring. At breakfast, my dear niece Celia spoke of Mr. Pitt. Very well regarded, she said. I thought back to the delivery of the paraffin oil. 3 cans found full and a lamp upstairs completely topped up. A respected solicitor, a dark cottage, and a secret kept for decades. It is a tragedy. I had the pieces. The full oil cans, the extinguished lamp, the 30 years of morning walks. Old women with knitting needles do not make arrests, my dears. I have an appointment with Inspector Ferris.
I think the oil cans being full is interesting. Inspector Ferris received Miss Marple at the police station in Much Wenlock at 2 o'clock, which is to say, he came out to the waiting room and shook her hand and tried to look unhurried. He was a competent man. She could see that in 30 seconds. The way his desk was organized through the open door behind him, the absence of performance in how he held himself. He wasn't young, had been at this a long time, and had the slightly settled quality of someone who trusted his own judgment, which, she reflected, was sometimes useful, and sometimes precisely the problem. Miss Marple. He had done some research. She could tell from the look. You're staying with the Hargreaves at St. Edmunds? My niece. Yes. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all. You had questions about the Fenn matter. Just 1 or 2 small things. The oil cans, 3 of them, I believe, a delivery made the Thursday before Mrs. Turb. Fenn died. Ferris nodded. Found full, which suggested she hadn't been using them. The delivery driver confirmed he'd left them in the usual place outside the back door. And the bracket at the upstairs window. The lamp was kept there. That's right. Paraffin lamp, very old, cleaned and ready. He paused. Still full of oil as it happened. She'd filled it recently. Miss Marple looked at him. The lamp itself was full. Yes. And the 3 delivery cans were also full. Yes. She could see him seeing it. The thing you notice when someone else points at it, and then find yourself astonished you didn't notice before. 3 full delivery cans and a lamp that had also been filled, but not lit. Not that night. The lamps were extinguished, she said. Then the cans were refilled. Ferris was quiet for a moment. That's one reading. Is there another? He had the grace not to pretend there was. I'll want to speak to the oil merchant again, he said, about the delivery, whether he noticed anything at the property. He looked at her steadily. You have a name in mind. I have a question, Miss Marple said, which was not quite an answer. Witchford Holt, 1987. The postal registry fire. Do you recall the details? Something shifted in Ferris's expression. Not much, just enough. Roy Caddick, he said, night watchman, arson charge. He served 9 years, I believe. He maintained his innocence throughout. A pause. He died in 2019. Yes, said Miss Marple. I thought he might have. She thanked Inspector Ferris, declined tea, and caught the 3:30 bus back to Witchford Holt. The countryside went past in its late October fashion, is subdued and still, the fields draining of colour as the light went. She thought about Roy Caddick, who had maintained his innocence for 9 years, and then presumably stopped. In the way people do when maintaining it stops making any difference. She thought about Dorothea Fenn, who had spent 30 years writing letters she never sent. And she thought about Gerald Pitt's morning walk, and the gap in the hedge, and the way a man will stand very still when watching for something to be there that isn't there anymore. The bus smelled again of wet dog. She rather thought it was the same dog.
At our age, we learn that a uniform commands respect, but it does not automatically command the truth.
Inspector Ferris was a thoroughly competent man, with a tidy desk and a confident manner. The oil cans were full, yet the lamp inside was full and extinguished. I reminded the inspector that a recently extinguished paraffin lamp leaves a charred wick. It is dreck. It is difficult for a proud man, yet profound grace lies in changing one's mind when faced with truth. With the present murder clarified, I gently guided his memory to the past. I brought up the name of Roy Caddick, the innocent night watchman who went to prison for that fire. Dorothea knew the truth of that fire, and she kept it hidden. Fear is a terrible master, my dears.
Before the trap closes entirely, I have my own quiet appointment to keep. And I am quite looking forward to a friendly chat.
Celia arranged the introduction without knowing she was doing it. This was, Miss Marple had found, the most reliable method. You mentioned a name in the right tone. Not pressing, not obviously interested, just present, and someone who liked arranging things would arrange them. Celia was that sort of person. She mentioned Gerald Pitt at supper Wednesday, and by Thursday morning Celia had remembered he was coming to discuss the church roof fund, and by Thursday afternoon she'd suggested he stay for tea, and by 4 o'clock Miss Marple was sitting in the front room, with a man who had killed someone and was being very careful not to show it. He was courteous, more than courteous actually. There was a quality to his attention, the way he asked questions and listened to the answers. That would have been charming under different circumstances. He had the manner of a man who had spent 40 years making people feel their concerns were reasonable. Solicitor's habit. His hands, she noticed, were very clean, scrubbed-looking, and the kind of clean that is a practice rather than a condition. His eyes were grey. She noted this. "You knew Mrs. Fenn," Miss Marple said when Celia had gone to fetch more milk. Not a question. 40 years, more or less. Pitt set his cup down, precisely in the centre of the saucer. She was a private person, not unfriendly, just contained. He paused at the word as if filing it. "It's a great shock, of course, a neighbour of that long standing. She kept the lamps burning every night, or so I'm told. She did. Her husband's tradition, she always said. Edward Fenn, a surveyor, very methodical man. He started it when they moved to the cottage, and she continued it after he died." Pitt's gaze moved briefly to the window. One got rather used to seeing the light. "Did you walk past the cottage often?" "Most mornings. It's a good lane." He said this without hesitation, smoothly. Then, "I'd noticed the light, yes, when it was dark early. As one does. He was good." Miss Marple had encountered good liars before, and poor ones, and the difference was less about confidence than about preparation. Poor liars didn't know which questions were coming. Good ones did. Pitt had been preparing for questions about those lamps for a long time, possibly years, since before Dorothea died, since before the question had become dangerous. He had his answers ready the way a solicitor has documents ready. In order, indexed. "Were the lamps burning to the very end?" she asked, lightly, as if curious. "As far as I knew." He met her eyes and held them steadily. "I didn't see them the night she died, I'm afraid. I don't walk in the evenings." Past tense, she noticed. "As far as I knew. Present in the first sentence, past in the second. Not an error exactly. More the kind of small grammatical drift that happens when someone is managing two truths simultaneously and loses track of the tense." She let it sit. She asked him about the church roof fund, which interested him visibly less, but which he discussed with perfect composure, and at 5:15 he thanked Celia, and put on his coat and left.
Mr. Pitt was the very picture of respectability. True character, my friends, is not found in how well a man wears his suit. I noticed his hands as he took his teacup. The nails were perfect, but the skin was raw. We spoke of poor Dorothea. He called her a private woman, contained. As far as I knew, I didn't see the lamps the night she died. I don't walk in the evenings. A slip in the tents. The trap was set. Celia, dear girl, arranged for Mr. Gerald Pitt to join us for afternoon tea.
His hands, when he shook hers at the door, were still very warm. Vera Luce found Miss Marple the following morning, which suggested she'd been looking. She was waiting near the post-box, the same post-box where the bus had dropped Miss Marple 4 days ago, wearing a good wool coat that belonged to a different landscape, city coat, and she had the focused look of someone who had decided to be direct and was bracing herself for it. Miss Marple. She said it the way people do when they've been told who you are and are still working out what that means. I'm Vera Luce. I've been staying at the pub. Someone told me you'd been asking questions about Dorothea Fenn. Have you? I'm a journalist. She said it quickly, as if removing a plaster. I told people I was a researcher. Local history. I'm sorry about that. She paused. I received a letter 3 months ago. Anonymous. It said the Witchford Holt postal registry fire in 1987 was not what it appeared to be. That the man who went to prison for it was innocent, and that the person responsible was still in the village and was, and I'm quoting now, about to become rather prominent. Miss Marple looked at her with interest. Anonymous. The postmark was Witchford Holt. The handwriting was elderly, very precise, formal. Vera's jaw tightened slightly. I should have acted on it faster. I came when I could, but I took 3 months to... I kept thinking it might be nothing. Did you speak to Mrs. Fenn? I tried to. She received me twice. The first time she was perfectly pleasant and told me very little. The second time she said she was considering whether to formalize certain information she'd been keeping. And would I come back the following week? Vera stopped. She died before the following week. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. A cart from the farm supply came down the lane, and they both stepped aside for it. The driver touched his cap without looking at them. You spoke to other people in the village, Miss Marple said, while you were here, asking about the fire. Yes, including Gerald Pitt? Vera Luce went still. Yes. He was on the parish council in 1987. I thought he'd have memories of the fire, the investigation. I asked him how well he'd known Dorothea Fenn. What did he say? He paused. She said it as if she'd been thinking about it since. Just before the name. A half second, maybe less. Then he said they'd been neighbours a long time. She was a private woman. He'd miss her. Vera looked at Miss Marple directly. He already knew she was dead. I hadn't told him yet. Miss Marple said, No, I don't suppose you had.
But poor Vera had waited 3 months to act on the letter. She thought it might be nothing. She finally spoke to Dorothea, who was hesitant. Dorothea asked her to return the following week. And she died before that following week could arrive. It breaks the heart, doesn't it?
The timeline was now terrifyingly clear. But a slip of the tongue to a frightened journalist is not enough to hang a respectable...
Robert Hargreaves, as executor of Dorothea Fenn's estate, such as it was, and being a cottage in trust, and some furniture, and a cat charity bequest, had access to her writing desk. He brought the letters to Miss Marple on Saturday evening, somewhat reluctantly, in a cardboard box that had previously contained tinned tomatoes. I don't know if you should, he said, legally. Probably not, Miss Marple agreed, and opened the box. There were 31 letters in total. Each one was dated. Each was addressed to a Mr. Roy Caddick. Each had been folded once and never put in an envelope. They spanned from November 1987 to October of the current year, the final one written 3 weeks before Dorothea died. The handwriting was small and very even, the kind that comes from being taught properly and never losing the habit. She did not read them all. She read the first, which was the shortest, and the last, which was the longest, and several in the middle. The first said, in its entirety, "I know what I saw. I have been trying to decide what to do with knowing it. I expect I shall decide nothing, as one does. But I wanted to write it down." What she had seen in January 1987 was Gerald Pitt leaving the postal registry at 11:45 at night, on an evening when he had no business being there. She had been returning from her sister's in Much Wenlock, had taken the shortcut past the registry, as she always did, and had seen him come out of the side entrance and walk quickly in the direction of Beechin Lane. The registry burned at 2 in the morning. Roy Caddick, the night watchman who was supposed to have left at 11, was found asleep in the back office. He'd stayed late, he said, because he'd been waiting for a delivery that never came. He had no alibi worth mentioning. He had, the prosecution noted, a record of petty theft from 15 years earlier, which had nothing to do with arson, but was the sort of thing that colours a jury. The middle letters documented Pitt's subsequent life with the careful attention of someone who had nothing else to do with what they knew. His partnership, his marriage, 1991, his wife's death, 2003, his increasing prominence in village affairs, his name 3 months ago appearing in the local paper as a candidate for the district council. He is going to win, one letter said. I find I cannot bear it. The last letter was dated the 6th of October. I have written to a journalist. I have also left certain arrangements with a young man whose uncle was Roy. He will come for these when the time is right. I am rather tired of keeping them. I am rather tired of a great many things. But I find that I am not afraid, which surprises me. Miss Marple sat with that for a while. The cat charity bequest made sense now. No family, no one to fight for her, no one to ask awkward questions if she fell. Pitt would have known that. He'd known everything about Dorothea Fenn for 40 years, from the gap in the hedge on his morning walk. I find that I am not afraid. She folded the last letter back along its original crease and set it carefully on top of the others. Robert, who had been pretending to read in the corner, said quietly, "Is it what you thought?" "It's what I was afraid it might be," Miss Marple said, which was not the same thing. "These will need to go to Inspector Ferris, all of them, tomorrow morning, I think. Should I?" "Yes," she said. "Ring him tonight." She closed the cardboard box. Outside, the Shropshire dark had settled fully, and the lane was very still, and somewhere down the track the cottage sat empty, with its cold windows, and its full oil cans, and its bracket, with nothing hanging from it. 31 letters, 30 years of knowing and saying nothing, and knowing she was saying nothing. Miss Marple found she had rather less sympathy for this than she might have expected. And then, considering Dorothea Fenn's age in 1987, 27, newly widowed, alone in a cottage at the edge of a village where a man like Gerald Pitt was already established, trusted, respectable, she revised her judgment. As she sometimes had to. It was one thing to know. It was another to be believed.
Isn't it strange, my dears, how the most explosive truths are often carried in the humblest of vessels? Inside were 31 letters. The handwriting was perfectly even, disciplined. But underneath that perfect penmanship, a soul was drowning in guilt. When he announced his run for the district council, the dam finally broke. "I cannot bear it," she wrote. "I must confess, I initially felt a flush of anger."
Her final letter was written just weeks before she died. "I find that I am not afraid," she wrote.
The law is a different creature than the truth. As we reach the twilight of our lives, I sealed her truth into an envelope for Inspector Ferris. The voiceless finally had a voice.
The tea was very good, and this was the first thing Miss Marple noticed about Gerald Pitt's house. Not the house itself, which was what people usually noticed, a solid Edwardian semi on Beechin Lane, well maintained, the kind that announces its owner is organised and has been for some time. Not the sitting room, which was orderly to the point of self-consciousness, every surface performing a kind of careful respectability. The tea was good because someone who knew what they were doing had made it, and that someone was Mrs. Dolly Prout, who came in 3 days a week and talked without apparent need for encouragement. Miss Marple had arranged the visit through Celia, who had arranged it through the parish council treasurer, and who had mentioned to Pitt that Miss Marple was interested in the history of the village's older properties. And would he mind terribly? And Pitt, who could hardly say he minded, had said he'd be delighted. She had noted the word, delighted, the word of a man who has decided exactly what he is. He was not at home when she arrived. Mrs. Prout showed her in, poured tea, and explained that Mr. Pitt had been delayed at the council offices, but would be back within the hour. Miss Marple said that was perfectly all right. She settled into the chair nearest the window, accepted a biscuit, and let Mrs. Prout talk. Aunt Prout was 63, and had been keeping house for Gerald Pitt for 11 years, and had the particular loyalty of someone who has decided their employer is fundamentally decent, and finds this decision easier to maintain if certain things are not examined too closely. She was not stupid. She simply preferred not to be asked. Miss Marple did not ask. She said it must have been a shock, Mrs. Fenn dying so suddenly. "Oh, terrible," Mrs. Prout said with genuine feeling. "He took it hard, Mr. Pitt. Well, they'd known each other such a long time, hadn't they? He went very quiet the day it came out. Sat in that chair the whole evening." She nodded at the chair across from Miss Marple. "Didn't want his supper. Had he been to see her recently, do you know? He went round occasionally, not often. She wasn't one for visitors, Mrs. Fenn." Mrs. Prout refreshed Miss Marple's cup without being asked, which was the mark of a good housekeeper. "He came back rather late one evening last week. Or not last week, the week before now. The Thursday, I think." Miss Marple kept her hands still in her lap. "Thursday. I'd left his supper on the side. He was later than he'd said, but I don't like to go before the food's been seen to. He came in, must have been 9 o'clock, 9:30, and he was, well, not himself exactly. Quiet in a different way." Mrs. Prout frowned at the teapot. "I noticed he had something on his sleeve. Left sleeve here." She touched her own forearm. "I thought it was engine oil at first, but it was thinner than that. More like—" She stopped. "Like lamp oil," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Prout looked at her. A long moment, and the frown didn't deepen so much as settle, becoming something more permanent. "I didn't ask," she said finally. "I thought he'd been in the garden shed, perhaps, or—" She stopped again. "Of course," Miss Marple said. Her voice was unhurried. The same voice she used for everything. For asking about the weather, for discussing the flower rota, for saying things that could not be unsaid. It's not the sort of thing one asks about, is it? A mark on a sleeve. Mrs. Prout set the teapot down carefully. Is it important? I'm afraid it might be. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, a car slowed on Beechin Lane and then accelerated away. Not Pitt. Mrs. Prout's hands, Miss Marple noticed, which had gone very still on the arms of her chair. The stillness of someone who has understood something and is deciding whether to keep understanding it. "He's a good man," she said, not as an argument. More the way people say things they have believed for a long time and are now holding up to check the weight. "Most people are," Miss Marple said. "In the ordinary run of things," she paused. "It's the extraordinary circumstances that tend to be the difficulty." Mrs. Prout said nothing. She looked at the window, and then at her hands, and then at a point somewhere between the two. Miss Marple left before Pitt returned. She walked back along Beechin Lane in the 4 o'clock dark, which arrived early now, and had a quality almost of reproach. The lamp oil, the Thursday evening, and the 9 o'clock return, and the mark on the sleeve, and the supper he didn't want. She had not needed him to confess. She had not needed, in the end, much at all. What had happened was not difficult to reconstruct. It was the kind of thing that was never as complicated as it seemed from the outside, once you had the correct pieces in the correct order. Gerald Pitt had known for some time that Dorothea Fenn's silence had a limit. He'd known it since the district council announcement, probably, had watched her more carefully after that, through the gap in the hedge, checking each morning that the lamp still burned on its ordinary schedule, and nothing had changed. Then Vera Luce arrived. A journalist asking questions about the 1987 fire. Asking them in the village, in the pub, of people who'd been there. Asking them, most dangerously, but of Pitt himself, who had answered without letting her see that each question was a small catastrophe. He was very good at that. He'd had 40 years of practice. But Vera Luce had gone to Dorothea. And whatever Dorothea had said, or not said, but implied, or simply let hang in the air between them, was enough. Pitt would have understood immediately. He had always understood immediately. That was rather the point. He went to the cottage on Thursday evening. What was said between them, Miss Marple didn't know and couldn't reconstruct with any confidence. Perhaps he tried to reason with her. Perhaps he threatened her. Though Dorothea Fenn hadn't struck Miss Marple from the letters as someone who threatened easily. Perhaps there had been no conversation at all. Just Pitt seeing the writing desk open, or the letter to Vera Luce half finished, and something in him making a decision that his mind caught up to later. The stairs were steep. Dorothea was 74. A frail woman, poor light. After he had been very methodical. Put out the lamps. All of them. The one in the bracket and the ones downstairs, so the cottage looked as though she hadn't lit them that evening. Then the oil cans, refilled from the lamp itself, topped up to suggest the delivery had simply sat untouched. The kind of careful indexing mind that thought 3 steps ahead and then covered the steps. Except for his sleeve. He hadn't thought about his sleeve. Miss Marple had encountered this before. Not this exactly. Not this particular configuration of gilt and lamp oil and 30 years of letters, but the pattern underneath it. And the very careful man, who is so busy covering the large things that he forgets himself entirely. His own arm, his own return time, the housekeeper who was still there. She turned her collar up against the dark. There was a woman in St. Mary Mead. She found herself thinking about her now. Not Constance Fellows this time, but a different one. A woman called Agnes Marsh, who had known something she shouldn't have known for 20 years, and had kept it the way one keeps a debt, silently, with mounting interest. When she finally told it, the thing had grown so large in the telling that no one quite believed her. Dorothea had been afraid of that, perhaps. Or perhaps not afraid. The last letter said she wasn't afraid, but aware of it. Aware of exactly what a woman alone in a cottage at the edge of a village was worth as a witness, against a man who had organised the restoration of the Lich Gate and was standing for district council. So she had documented 31 letters, 30 years of precise observation. Not sent, but kept, not nothing. The cottage came into view at the end of the track. Still dark, still empty, the bracket at the upstairs window, a small iron parenthesis against the sky, holding nothing. "I find that I am not afraid," she had written. Miss Marple stood on the lane for a moment, long enough for the cold to find the gaps in her coat. Then she went back to Celia's and sat down, and wrote out, in her own careful hand, a summary of what she knew and what could be evidenced, and what Inspector Ferris would need to look for. The letters, the oil merchant's docket, Mrs. Prout's account of Thursday evening, the gap in the hedge, it earned the 30 years of morning walks. And the grey eyes that had watched the upstairs window of a dead woman's cottage for reasons that were never sentiment. She sealed it in an envelope, addressed it, set it by the door for Robert to take in the morning. Then she made a cup of tea, properly this time, having learned the kettle, and sat by the window in the dark and thought about Roy Caddick, who had maintained his innocence for 9 years, and then presumably found somewhere quieter to put it, and who had died in 2019 without anyone in Witchford Holt saying his name in any particular way. Someone would say it now. It was not enough. It was, she thought, what there was.
Mr. Pitt's house was a grand, solid Edwardian building. At our age, we learn to distrust absolute perfection, don't we?
I was served tea by Mrs. Dolly Prout, his housekeeper of 11 years. We humans have a remarkable capacity for loyalty, my dears. I gently asked her about the night Dorothea died. Thursday. A disruption in routine is the loudest alarm bell in any household. I walked home in the fog. The puzzle was complete. It was no longer a mystery. Back at the vicarage, I sat at the desk and wrote down everything. The letters, the oil cans, the stained sleeve. I thought of Roy Caddick. 9 years in a prison cell for a fire he didn't start. We cannot rewind the clock. The law is a different creature than the truth. As we reach the twilight of our lives, the envelope is sealed and waiting by the door. The long, silent night is over. The truth, my dears, has finally come out.
Inspector Ferris came to St. Edmund's on Sunday morning. He came after the 8 o'clock service, which he had not attended, and before the 11 o'clock, which he also would not attend, arriving in the narrow window between the two, with the look of a man who had been awake since considerably earlier and had used the time productively. He had the envelope Miss Marple had sent. He had, she noted, read it more than once. The fold marks said so. Robert showed him into the front room and retreated with the tact of a man who has learned, in parish work, when not to be present. Ferris sat down. He put the envelope on the table between them and looked at it for a moment, as if deciding something. "The oil merchant," he said. "I spoke to him again yesterday. He's certain the cans were delivered full on Thursday. He's also certain," he checked his book, that he'd filled them himself Thursday morning from the depot, if fresh stock. So if the cans were found full on Friday, someone topped them up after the delivery, yes. Ferris was quiet. The lamp in the bracket had been refilled recently as well. Our initial examination noted it was full, which we took to mean she'd filled it and simply not lit it that evening. But if someone filled it after putting it out, the oil would show no burn residue, Miss Marple said. The wick had been used recently. Ferris looked at her steadily. How do you know about burn residue on wicks? I had a paraffin lamp for 30 years, Miss Marple said. One gets to know them. He almost smiled. Not quite. Mrs. Prout came in this morning. Of her own accord, I want to be clear about that. She came in at 7:30 and asked to make a statement. He paused. The sleeve, the Thursday evening. The time of return. He looked at the envelope again. She was not easy about it. No, Miss Marple said, she wouldn't be. She said. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. She said she'd been thinking about it since Friday, since someone asked her a question she hadn't been asked before. Miss Marple said nothing. Pitt was brought in last night, Ferris said. He hasn't admitted anything. He's a solicitor. He knows exactly how much rope to give and where to stop. But the letters combined with Mrs. Prout's statement and the oil merchant's records, he exhaled. It's not nothing. No, it isn't. The Caddick matter will take longer. He considered his words. That's a different investigation. An old one. There are people who'll need to be involved who aren't involved yet. He looked at her directly. Roy Caddick had a nephew. Did you know that? I suspected it. He came forward this morning as well. Apparently, he'd been in the village last week. Ferris's expression was carefully neutral. He found the cottage unlocked, found the body, left. A pause. He didn't take the letters, said he couldn't find them, couldn't find anything, panicked and left. He's been not sleeping well since. The man in the brown hat, who had carried nothing and whom no one could quite describe. He had been there and found nothing and carried that home with him. He'll need to make a statement, Miss Marple said. He already has. Ferris picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, set it back down. You've done this before? I've noticed things before, Miss Marple said. It's not quite the same. Celia drove her to the bus stop at 1:30, and the car had been returned by the curate, who had had the grace to look abashed about it. The day was cold and bright, the kind of October Sunday that can't quite decide whether to be beautiful or bleak, and compromises by being both. The fields along the Shrewsbury Road were very still. A heron stood in the corner of a flooded furrow, doing nothing in particular with great concentration. Will they convict him? Celia asked at the bus stop. I don't know. Miss Marple meant this. The evidence it points very firmly in one direction. But pointing and proving are different things, and he'll have good legal representation. And Dorothea's letters are 30 years old, and were never sent, and were never meant to be found the way they were found. She paused. The Caddick matter may be simpler, paradoxically. The physical evidence from a fire scene lasts if it was stored properly, and the nephew has the letters now. So Roy Caddick might be, posthumously. Yes, I think so, eventually. Celia was quiet for a moment. Is that enough? Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The heron in the flooded field lifted one leg and set it down again, having apparently reconsidered. It's what there is, she said. The bus appeared at the bend, slightly early for once, which was either a good omen or a scheduling error? Miss Marple picked up her bag. She wasn't afraid, Celia said suddenly. At the end, you said that. She wrote that, yes. Do you think it's true? Miss Marple thought about Dorothea Fenn in her brown cardigan that had shaped itself to her, in the cottage that had no business being where it was, no writing letters for 30 years to a man she'd never quite managed to save. Filling the lamp every evening and hanging it in the bracket and letting it say to whoever was watching from the lane, I am still here. I know what I know. I think, Miss Marple said, that she had decided, and there's a kind of peace in deciding, even when what you've decided is difficult. She moved toward the bus. Whether it's the same as not being afraid, I really couldn't say. She found a seat on the left side, which would give her the fields rather than the road. The bus pulled away with its familiar shudder, and the smell, yes, still unmistakably, of the same wet dog. She watched Witchford Holt contract through the window. The church tower first, then the rooftops, then the lane that ran past the hedge with the gap in it. And she couldn't see the cottage from this angle. It was the wrong side of the village, the wrong elevation. But she knew where it was. She would know where it was for some time, she thought. The bracket at the upstairs window, the oil cans in a row, the lamp that had been filled and extinguished and filled again to say it had never been lit, by a methodical man who had spent 30 years watching for the light to go out, and had finally, at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening in October, put it out himself. The truth she had once told someone, she couldn't remember who now or when, is almost always locked in something small. A hem, a timing, a mark on a sleeve. In this case, a full oil can, and an empty conscience that had needed 30 years of morning walks to maintain itself, and still hadn't managed it, not quite, because Dorothea Fenn had kept writing the letters even when she didn't send them. And the words had stayed on the page, and the page had stayed in the desk, and the desk had stayed in the cottage. And some things, this was what Miss Marple had learned, in a long life of noticing things. Some things simply wait. She folded her hands in her lap. The bus went on through the still Shropshire countryside, and the light was going in that gradual autumnal way that seems less like darkening and more like the world turning something over, quietly, to look at the other side. She thought about Roy Caddick once more. 9 years, the particular weight of that, the way a man might come out the other side of it, older, smaller, carrying something that had no name for it anymore, because he'd stopped expecting anyone to ask. Someone was asking now, and too late for him, not perhaps for the asking itself. The bus rounded the long bend toward Shrewsbury, and Witchford Holt was gone from the window. And Miss Marple took out her knitting. She'd been neglecting it shamefully, 3 days of barely a row, and the needles began their familiar click. And she let her mind go still in the particular way it went still after these things, not empty, but resting. The way a room rests after something has finally been said aloud in it that should have been said a long time ago. Outside, the fields went past. The heron, or another one very like it, stood in a ditch at the roadside and watched the bus go by without particular interest. Finn.
Sunday morning arrived crisp and cold. Inspector Ferris came to the vicarage. The law is a different creature than the truth. As we reached the twilight of our lives, he sat opposite me, the envelope in hand. He admitted the police had made a mistake. They saw a full lamp and assumed Dorothea had simply forgotten to light it. But the final nail in Mr. Pitt's coffin did not come from me. They arrested Gerald Pitt that very night. But he is a solicitor. He sat in the interrogation room. As we drove away, I saw a grey heron standing in a flooded ditch. It watched us pass with absolute indifference. Celia drove me to the bus stop. She looked at me, so young and anxious, and asked, "Will they convict him?" I had to tell her the truth. I don't know.